Intro part 3. 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. My name is Miles. This is my friend Jeff, and we are.
You can use it. You can still use it. Go. You got it.
We're part of the Casualities podcast, and today we're going to be talking about the favorite fictional thing from Breaking Bad, the cartels. Good thing they're only in the TV show, not in real life.
Yeah, the cartels don't play any real part in the real world at all. They have never done anything. There's no such thing as a cartel. Other than the terrible things that they have done and the terrible things that they have done specifically in Mexico, because that is what we're covering today, is the cartels in Mexico. And there's been some recent developments about them, and they have a big and profound impact on the United States, and I kind of wanted to get into that. So that is what we're covering today.
I can't believe they made drugs from Breaking Bad real.
Exactly. You very much are a casualty for talking about Breaking Bad, having never watched the show.
I have not seen a single episode. I only know anything about it through memes.
And you're using memes as your education understanding. But let's get into some of the real cartel stuff. So I wanted to be able to talk about the situation today, but I just really have to just point out some numbers and things about the cartel. And since 2006, there has been roughly 431,000 homicides in Mexico. And it's believed about half of them at least are related to the drug war, and it is possible that that number could be as high as 90%. It's very fluctuating depending on how you count it as a casualty, but that is something that is just a huge number, because that, in the United States, for reference, has had 293,000 homicides in the exact same time period, and we have nearly triple the population.
That's more murders than the current population of Cincinnati.
Yes. We are in Cincinnati, and it has a population of roughly 300,000. Those homicides would wipe out the entire city and have 130,000 left over.
So who would win in a fight, Cincinnati or the entirety of the cartels in Mexico?
That's a terrible question.
I've seen stuff like that on Reddit.
So talking about the economy, it seems that the drug cartels take out roughly $40 billion out of the economy that could be spent on something else, on something better, that just gets put back into the cartels for things like protection rackets. A lot of it's actually going into buying the drugs that could go into the public sector for good working jobs, instead it goes to the cartel and things like that.
Well, I mean, the drugs are technically still going into the public.
Miles. Stop. But no, the public consumption of them actually is not super high in Mexico compared to other places, but it is something that is continuously developing into a problem where addiction becomes a regular issue. So 30 billion is the actual drug usage in Mexico. The other 10 billion comes from things like racketeering, human trafficking, protection schemes to be able to force people to buy protection so you don't go up and beat them up, things like that. That is also affecting the economy of Mexico as well. And they roughly spend about $12 billion a year in security in Mexico, and also the United States probably spends hundreds of millions of dollars to about $1 billion a year in aid to Mexico to fight the cartels. And I saw this number was given by the UN. They say roughly $153 billion is spent worldwide to fight the cartel. That feels like it has to be way too high of a number. And I think that's because they count the budget of every agency fighting the cartels, and the real number is probably closer to 30 billion. But still, that's a lot of money that the world's spending to fight this thing. And last but not least, I think just culturally, the effect of the cartels has had on Mexican culture. How many people have viewed Mexicans negatively because they've assumed that they're cartel related or something like that, and has really dampened the expression, the advancement, and also the sharing of Mexican culture, which is very steeped, very, very actually exciting, very positive, and is something where if you ever meet anyone that has immigrated from Mexico, they are very excited to be able to share and express their culture as much as possible. And it's a very beautiful thing to see, but unfortunately it has been stereotyped so much because of the cartel presence. Anything you have to add to that?
I was thinking of a joke, but I couldn't think of one, so it's probably better I just keep silent.
All jokes today. All right. So we're going to finally get into the first bit of this actual presentation here. So first thing we're going to have is this topographic map of Mexico. And what does this play into the story? Well, one of the big things we're trying to talk about is just the history of Mexico in general. Number one, Mexico is very hard to get across because if you look at that map, what do you see?
A lot of mountains.
Is it easy to get across mountains?
For me, yeah, but for everybody else, no.
Oh, you think you're such a mountain climber?
I play Minecraft. I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different mountain ranges, and the weird thing is several mountain ranges kind of collide into each other. There's no real navigable rivers that cover the whole country or at least cover huge parts of it, and that is very difficult. On the east side there, you can see that there's a lot of jungle. If you go down to the southeast, that little peninsula that juts out, that is the Yucatan. That is very jungle, very tropical. It's hard to get around. One of the most isolated cities are there. And you see in the northwest, there's a lot of desert. There's a lot of land that's just not very good for agriculture and is ultimately just very bad for being able to build a strong central state where it's easy to get around places. And one of the things that this did for Mexico was it is hard to have institutional control from the center. And that is something that would become very apparent when you get to these remote regions. The center control just falls apart. It's not able to get to these regions. So instability in Mexico has been a thing pretty much going back to its revolution in 1910. And Mexico has had very little stability. For the majority of that time, they didn't have free or fair elections. It was something that they were dealing with. And it was honestly just a terrible situation to be in. And this would force the government to essentially instill local power players that would be able to control the region. Instead of having a police station in a village, what they would do is go to someone who's like a strong man in the village that has like 12 or 13 guys that work for him and say, hey, if you guys can keep the peace, we'll just pay you and look the other way for your different crimes and things that they commit that help bring them money for themselves.
That's a really dumb idea that they did that.
Well, that's called a patronage system, and that is how that works. And essentially, Mexico, since 1940, has always had crime families, and they have played a huge part of the state role of controlling remote regions, being able to do that. And whenever there was feuds between crime families, the state would essentially come in and intercede between them. They would try to do this. And this held up pretty well because Mexico at that time was a one-party system. The PRI party, the party of the Revolutionary Independence Party, I think is what it stands for. They controlled Mexican power from essentially 1928 all the way up until 2000. And even though it is not, most people wouldn't call it this today, when it was first founded, it was a party in fascist principles. So
right, that was kind of popular during that time.
Yes. And they would essentially lead by trying to find local leaders that were these crime families and essentially utilize them for everything they do. Any thoughts on that, Miles, at all, about just like talking about the institutional control and whatnot?
You said this is from like 1928 to the 2000s?
Yeah, we're going to go to the 70s, but like between that time, they essentially would just use these local leaders as like a patron system where the state governor would go to his local leader and say, hey, if you keep these 5 villages in line, I'm going to pay you, and we don't have to put any infrastructure out there or anything.
Okay.
So that is essentially what they did. They'd have these strongmen that would control these different regions inside the country. So with that, you also have the development of drug operations in other countries around the world, most notably and most famously Colombia.
Right.
Where you have the infamous Pablo Escobar. If you ever get to know me really well, I have this kind of thing for Pablo Escobar. I love his business acumen. He's a terrible human being, but I just find his life fascinating. I don't know why. It's just a personal thing. But he starts leading the Medellin cartel to prominence in Colombia. We start getting to the 1980s where they're bringing a lot of their supply and product over here into the United States via Florida and Texas. And this is where you start seeing the first real drug dealers that aren't the British Empire actually making millions and billions of dollars.
Wait, what? What about the Brits again?
We'll cover that at some point. The Opium Wars. Britain was probably the largest drug dealer in history.
Right.
To China.
I forgot about the Opium Wars.
But that's besides the point. But this is the first non-state actor that is selling drugs on a huge level. And it's to the point that they're probably selling drugs in today's money would probably be close to 60 or 70 billion dollars is what you see Pablo Escobar making, what you see the Cali cartel making. They're making all this money. They're making buku dollars.
And schools told us not to do drugs, even though it's one of the most profitable businesses you can get into.
Miles, they didn't do the drugs. They sold them.
Well, do as in like being a part of the industry. That's what I meant.
I don't think you're being a good example to the world out there right now. I think I have to call the UN on you.
Implying I'm not already on the watch list.
You aren't. You aren't.
American dream.
So anyways, then we have this, as you can see up here on the next slide that is going to come up. We have the Caribbean route. That is where you take all the drugs, mainly cocaine supplies from Colombia, and they would go via plane or boat through these islands, and they would usually go up to Florida. Miami was the hot spot of drugs. Miami was the place where you get a lot of the cocaine, and then it would be dispersed into the United States. The other place that they would go is usually they fly into a place near New York and then distribute drugs up there as well. But it's mainly East Coast stuff, and this is where the Colombian cartels would be selling their stuff. There was some stuff going through Mexico. However, Mexico was very much the junior partner. They were not as important, and this was just mainly a cocaine-driven drug spree.
Cocaine-driven economy.
Amazing.
Yes. So just like California.
This is the narco state. This is the birth of Colombia getting into the narco state. And during this time, you will see Mexico essentially just trying to be intermediaries and say, hey, we're able to get a large amount of drugs into the United States via Texas, Arizona, California. In fact, if you look at that region, everything on the west side of the country is probably going to be about nearly half the population, because California is a huge state. Just north of California, you got Oregon and Washington. Arizona is closest to has big cities in itself. Phoenix is huge. Tucson's big. Las Vegas is right there. You can go further northeast and get into Denver, things like that. You have a lot of supply lines that they can go through. So during this time, a couple of guys get together and they form the first truly big and independent Mexican cartel called the Guadalajara Cartel. These are led by three men named I want to make sure I get the name right. Quintero, Francesca Carrillo, and Felix Gallardo. These would be the three men that would lead this cartel. Quintero was the leader. He essentially was a former state policeman. He was the guy that would be the mediator between rival crime families. And he took two guys that he knew in the Guadalajara area and said, okay, I think I see a profitable plan here. Because during this time, in the early 80s, there was a connection made between drug cartels and communists. And with Ronald Reagan as the American president, that ain't going to fly.
Not the cartel part, but the communism part.
Well, we're going to get into that in a second. The cartels were using communist funds to be able to help expand their operation. And that is something where the United States cracked down on that. We actually, I believe, sent troops into Haiti because of that. We sent troops into several Caribbean islands, and we also did a lot of military assistance to rebels in those areas. Particularly, you'll see the Contras in Nicaragua, who we supported them and were essentially funding them with weapons and drug money that America sold to be able to fund them. That's where you get the whole CIA selling cocaine. Which there's only one source that's ever confirmed that CIA sold cocaine in the United States. There is confirmation that the CIA is selling cocaine to outside sources outside America. They're displaying of confirmed sources for that. But essentially what you see happen is the United States cracking down on the Caribbean, and you see Colombia having this Kingpin model where if you take out the head guys, you essentially have the whole organization fall apart. Mexico is trying to go in a different direction than that. You see Guadalajara here, and they are essentially the first Mexican cartel, and they want to do a different style. They want to be able to flatten the hierarchy and make it a lot harder to be able to bring them down if you lose one or two people. And along with this, also in Mexico, you have the falling apart of institutional control, because during the 80s, a lot of people are clamoring for democracy. A lot of people are clamoring for independence because It's been 50 years since a different party has won power in Mexico. And most of the elections have been uncontested, and a lot of students are protesting. There's a guerrilla war going on to have more democratic institutions inside the country of Mexico. And with this, the state is losing a lot of power to be able to support these strongmen. So these strongmen are going out on their own, and they're trying to be able to make their own money through their crime and able to sell a lot of narcotics. This is where they start establishing connections in Asia, because most methamphetamines are coming from Asia. They go into Mexican Pacific ports, and they are able to push it through up north. But essentially, what happened was they had grown so big that they started attracting the attention of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency.
Oh, those guys from Breaking Bad.
Yes, exactly. So they start seeing this collapse in Colombia, and the DEA played a huge part in that. And the DEA started getting involved in Mexico as well. And the Mexican cartels were very questionable of anyone that is participating in, or the cartel is very weary of outsiders, saying that they're going to come in and they're DEA agents that are going to attack us. And this incident happens in 1984, I do believe, where you have this DEA agent who's undercover, who is flying planes around over the province of, I want to believe it actually is in Sinaloa province, or not Sinaloa province, Sinaloa state. And that is a part in northwest Mexico that's very dry, very desert-like. And they essentially are starting to spot marijuana fields, and they're starting to spot a lot of labs, things like that. And the head of the cartel, Quintero, is starting to get very furious about this. So he starts essentially looking for Americans in Mexico at that time. And he finds this group of, I want to say that they were They were Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses go up to the wrong door, and this man is talking to them, and they assume that they're DEA agents hidden as Jehovah's Witnesses, and they brutally murder these people. And then also another day, right after that, two American tourists, a dentist and his wife, are down on vacation in Sinaloa, and they just happened to walk into the wrong restaurant having a party at the wrong time, and they were also kidnapped and brutally murdered. And eventually at this point, the DEA is also on to the cartel, and they find this huge pot field, this huge marijuana field in the middle of the desert, which if you've ever seen cannabis, it's pretty green. If you've ever seen a desert, it's pretty beige. And from the sky, when you see a 2,500 acre field that should not be there, it's going to raise a lot of suspicions.
They did not understand color theory.
No, and the big thing was the Mexican government had actually supplied them with information and images of this area, but they had intentionally given them several-year-old photos before the pot farm was made. And 2,500 acres, you're looking at miles of land, miles of green. I know, you're wearing green. I'm wearing green.
No, also my name is Miles.
I know. Stop. You're very ADD today. So it's probably because I gave you all that caffeine. Essentially, this guy sees this field. He has the Mexican army burn it up, and his name is Enrique Camarena. I think that's how you pronounce it. Enrique Camarena. And he is kidnapped by Enrique Quintero, and he is essentially tortured by his henchmen, one of whom is a guy named El Chapo, who you'll become very familiar with later, but we're going to call him Guzman right now. El Chapo Guzman goes and participates in the murder and or the torture of this man, who is beaten for about 30 hours. When they found his body later, his skull, jaw, nose, cheekbones, windpipe, and ribs were all broken. He had a hole drilled into his head, and he was also supposedly shot in all four limbs. And it was later confirmed that he had lidocaine in his heart, which means that a doctor came to bring him back to consciousness every time he passed out unconscious from the pain, to be able to make sure he experiences the torture more. And eventually, he dies from being hit with rebarb to the head.
Jesus.
And this guy is an American DEA agent, and Ronald Reagan himself commented on this and said that this could not pass. And essentially, the United States went to the Mexican government and said, you guys need to turn in this heads of this cartel now. And Mexico said, we will not do it. And the United States closed the border with Mexico. Trade, people, items could not cross the border. The Mexican economy was hit immediately, and that kicked the Mexican military into gear to immediately find these cartel. Do you have anything so far you want to add or ask her?
No, the question about who Enrique Cameron was, you already answered it. He was a DEA agent.
And before I move on from him, I would be remiss to not mention that some people, and I don't know how big this conspiracy goes, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong. I also don't necessarily think it's right either. They think that the CIA might have been in on it because he might have been getting too close to cartels funding the Contras in Nicaragua. We might be getting too close to a CIA operation that was funding another CIA operation. So there's some belief that the CIA was involved with that. And the reason why we believe that is because two agents have come forward stating that the CIA were present and authorized his execution.
Just so the CIA doesn't come after us, we don't believe this at all, and we think you guys are pretty cool.
Anyways, Quintero and Carrillo were found very fast. Within the next year, the Mexican military found them. And Felix Gallardo was forced into hiding. This led to where the Guadalajara cartel started to focus on being more underground and more secretive. And meanwhile, this is all happening, there's a whole other cartel called the Gulf Cartel that's operating on the east coast of Mexico. They're essentially moving stuff via boat to the United States. They're again going that Caribbean route, whereas Guadalajara is trying to get more stuff into the United States via just trucking, things like that. And during this time, you see where Guadalajara owns everything on the western half of Mexico, and they come together at this conference on Acapulco, Mexico in 1987, and they essentially say, this is too big, we need to split this up amongst ourselves, and we need to be able to figure out where we're going to go with this. So the 5 cartels, there were originally five great cartels in the area, and these were supposed to be great cartels that lead off into the 90s. These were going to be the guys that essentially lead it forward, and the way they separate themselves is by having the different border crossings and determining what was most important. So on the next slide, you'd see some of the border crossings. And of course, the biggest one is right there in Tijuana, which is right next to San Diego, a huge city. You also have another one there called Mexicali and on the Mexican side, and Cali-Exico on the California side. And those are 2 huge crossings. Nogales has a small town in Arizona right next to called Douglas. That's a crossing. Juarez and El Paso is a huge crossing. Nuevo Laredo is also another huge crossing. The other ones aren't really used as much. But there is a small one missing here that is called Tecate, which is literally between Calexico and San Diego.
San Diego.
It's a small town there. That is where Guzman is going to get his crossing. Of course, Felix Gallardo, the head of the cartel, is going to give himself Tijuana, which is the big crown jewel. That's the big thing that everyone wants. That's the one that everyone's going after. Guzman gets Tecate. Calexico goes to Quintero's cousin, Miguel Quintero. And Juarez goes to Carrillo Fuentes, who is the cousin of the Carrillo that founded the Guadalajara cartel. Those guys are both in prison. They will get out at some point, but they also go back into prison. And I think Quintero is also assassinated later on.
Rip, bozo.
But this would lead to where we see the cartel structure. And I know we've been talking a lot about this stuff early on, but really this is stuff that applies to the present day with the cartel. And this is actually the genius that we see of them inside there. Bless you.
Thank you.
What?
I actually make an edit with my sneeze. But if you know what YouTube poop is, make a edit of that to the beat of "This is Sparta."
This is Sparta. So here you have the cartel structure where one of the things that was the downfall of the Colombian cartels was they had this huge hierarchical structure.
Is that the green or the?
That's the purple. And
I said green. I meant to say blue. I am not colorblind. I'm just stupid.
But you see how there's essentially a hierarchy there, and then the other one has just this flat line. There's really one guy they're all responding to. El Chapo wanted that horizontal structure. They wanted to be able to have a bunch of different groups elsewhere because, number one, he wanted guys that specialized in their jobs. He wanted someone that is focused on one thing and one thing alone. They also wanted as few cogs intersecting as possible because if one gets found out by the police, you don't have to replace the whole section. Whereas and this actually became a huge issue for the Medellin cartel, where a guy in Cartagena was found, and that essentially led to like 1/3 of their business being arrested because he had all the documents, he had all the counting ledgers, and he had all the names. So they literally were all right there, and they were able to just pull it in immediately.
Skill issue.
It really was a skill issue. And he created this system called the plaza system, the boss system. So a cartel would have a specific group in a certain area, and they would have a boss, a jefe de la plaza, a boss of the square, and they would have independence and autonomy in that one area, and they would know everything going on in their area, but they would have no idea about other stuff going on. They would only hear it from certain couriers from the cartel. And essentially, they would be the ones that recruit local groups, they recruit local gangs, and this made it also a lot easier for the cartel to be able to invest in different areas faster and see where to best invest. So you get something like that. And a big thing that also Guzman was known for in founding the Sinaloa cartel was he was big on trying to get as much merit inside the cartel as possible, because everyone else was hiring their cousins, everyone else was hiring their brothers. He wanted the guys that would actually get the job done.
Sounds like a great HR manager.
Well, then there's the bad side of if you failed your job, you're getting a bullet to the back of the head.
Sounds
So
like
motivation was there.
Sounds like a great HR manager.
Motivation was there, but he would essentially just build this system out. And give an example of this, I just had like wrote down a few things of just like how the cartel is structured. So if we could go back to the slide, I just want to walk through a few things. Like essentially, you would receive precursor supplies, which is what they call the drugs before they're turned into actual pills or powder or anything. And that's essentially the supplier. They would come into ports on the Pacific coast because, again, everything's coming in from Asia. They would come in from the Asian continent for methamphetamine. They come in from the Pacific coast of Colombia up into Mexico. That's essentially how they do it. And a place like Collins Group, which is a shipping agency in Colima, would take it in. And then they would send it to like a city like Guadalajara. And they would go to a lab there. They turn it into pills. And a group in Guadalajara would essentially manufacture this, and they would send it to a distributor up in Juarez. Juarez is on the Mexican-American border. They would have a mule that knows how to get across that border. They would pay a toll to the mule. The mule, and this is a guy that hires the mule. He has probably 20 guys under him working it. But they would have a local gang that protects them, and they would work together to get across the border, and then they'd have their American affiliate gang move it into a big city, let's say like Dallas, and then from there they would get to distributors, and the distributors, your local drug dealer, who you go and buy your hard drugs from. And
Heard.
you see, there's a lot of moving parts there, right? But the goal was if one trucking group, like let's say you have a gang like La Lina. La Lina is a gang in Juarez. If they are all arrested, you can just hire another gang in the area. There's plenty of people for employing this. But the thing is, it's super easy because you just replace one cog with another. Whereas if it's all Sinaloa men, if you have a couple of Sinaloa men killed, you just lost your workforce and you can't do it. And the whole idea is the subsidiary system of being able to plug and play people is what Guzman saw. He had all the cartels were doing this, but he knew how to play that system perfectly.
The system had a better right to repair than Apple does.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't call it repairing. A bullet to the back of the head isn't a repair.
Well, I mean, if a piece gets broken, aka arrested, you can replace it easily, whereas with Apple, you have to buy a whole new computer. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. And this is where you get a lot of funny things and a lot of creativity where one of my favorite examples, this wasn't Guzman's idea, but he actually had similar things where he would get stuff across the border because he specialized in smuggling. He would buy a school bus for special needs kids. And they would go and take that school bus on a field trip. They go to the zoo, and while the kids are at the zoo, they would they would have all the product inside the frame of the bus. They would just drive over to some chop shop, lift up the frame, take out all the product, and then they go pick up the kids, and everyone's having a great day. And there's a whole bunch of different things with this that I'm going to get into on that. But essentially, the core of this, we go into the 90s, and there's this big feud going on in the Sinaloa and in the cartels between Tijuana, which is that big crown jewel in northwest Mexico, and Sinaloa. So Felix Gallardo, who was one of the founders of Guadalajara, he's a nasty man. He's known for beating up people like Enrique Camarena. He brutally killed that guy. And may God rest in peace. But he had a hard time being able to trust people. I don't know why, but but he was beefing with one of the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel called Hector Palma. Hector Palma was essentially one of the leaders and one of the enforcers in Sinaloa, and he was on the American side because I believe he had an American passport, but he would be able to cross the border, and he would have a lot of connections to the gangs inside Texas, inside Arizona specifically, and inside California, and he would help make sure that it got to its distribution destination. Well, Hector Palma somehow made Gallardo upset, and Gallardo had this Venezuelan go and kind of seduce his wife. And Hector Palma gets arrested, he goes to prison, and his wife runs off to Venezuela with this guy. His name's Clavel. And Clavel essentially is like, oh, you should take $7 million out of your husband's account and let's just go run off together. So they do run off to Venezuela. He successfully seduces her. As soon as they get to Venezuela, and he has 2 kids, he runs off with the 2 kids. He beheads Hector Palma's wife as soon as they get to Venezuela. And they videotape a few days later Hector Palma's 2 children being thrown off a bridge that's 500 feet tall.
Should we put a trigger warning in this video?
Yes, I think we are going to do that at the very end. But essentially this brutal murder of his wife Lopez is is instigating factor where essentially the Tijuana cartel, which is led by Gallardo and his successor, Arellano Felix, they would take over, and they would just be feuding with the Sinaloa cartel for decades. In fact, some of that ramifications can still be felt in Tijuana today. But this would lead to fighting, and this would essentially create the situation where Guzman would be like, hey, I need to find a way to be able to make the best of this situation right now because Tijuana is so far ahead of us. They're literally right on the border. Our base is in Sinaloa. We're 400 miles away from the border. We need to be able to get there. So this would make Guzman take sides with people. Zambada, Ishmael Elmeo Zambada would come to his side. The Beltran Lueva brothers, Ignacio and Nacho Coronel would also come to his side. And there'd be a lot of people also taking on to Gallardo's side. But essentially, Sinaloa would be the one organization that is able to be stable through this entire time, and they'd be really ingenuitive during the 90s. And we're going to talk about what made them great in the 90s and going into 2006. So this is covering a 14-year period. So with this, Guzman would essentially create his entire empire by being the best and smartest businessman he can. So the Sinaloa march to power essentially started with him learning how to be able to move stuff across the border really, really well. So the school bus is one strategy. His common strategy that he would actually use was to fill ethnic food trucks with Mexican meats, because if you ever go around in your town, you'll probably see a supermercado somewhere, something like that. You see them around, not to discriminate too much, but I'm willing to bet if you are not someone who is Hispanic, you've probably never ventured into a store like that. And a little life hack, if you ever want cheap meat, go into those stores. The meat there is infinitely cheaper than it is in a Kroger, and a Meijer, and a Target.
Is it because of the drugs? Or
No.
Okay.
It's because their suppliers tend to be a little bit more stable, and there's also much better relationship there. They tend to be family, things like that. But that is why they would also use that, because trucks being checked at the border, if it shows that it's a family restaurant, they felt that sorry, I dropped my pen. They felt that border guards are not going to be as likely to look through those trucks because that's really the only place they're going to be able to stop the drugs going into the country. And they'd hide it in the packages with the food. And this is how they move tons and tons of product. Most other cartels, mainly like Tijuana and Juarez, are having people move stuff with their backpacks. They're having people swallow those little pill things or like little rubber balls full of drugs and then have them push them out. Things like that. And those didn't always work and whatnot, and they would just fill up these little cars, whereas Guzman is getting truckloads of product across the border, no issues whatsoever. I shouldn't say no issues whatsoever, but he did do a great job at getting product across the border. And when he moved these products, he also was able to do it via airplane, and he was able to do it via submarine. And I'll tell you about how he was able to achieve that later.
Where did he get a submarine?
There's several narco submarines.
Why do they have submarines?
They're not big submarines. They're technically classified as midget submarines, but still. He would essentially disrespect the agreement to keep the 5 cartel boundaries, and he almost immediately blew that up because within the first couple of years of that conflict with Gallardo, he would build tunnels in Gallardo's territory in Tijuana over the border into San Diego. And he would build these huge tunnels. I think they said at the end of the day, they found something like 300 miles of tunnels underneath the U.S. border. And this was entirely built by Guzman, hiring out German construction companies to go in and build these tunnels underneath the U.S.-Mexico border.
Why specifically German?
Because they're the report I read said it was the cheapest engineering company to get that could do a good job. And I should mention, Guzman would have his Mexican comrades learn from these German engineers because that will come back later. He also was extremely good at being able to delegate tasks and things like that. He used the alternative shipping methods like we talked about earlier. He avoided nepotism like we also talked about earlier. And he knew who to befriend and how to be able to get his organization to be as efficient as possible. Zambada, his friend, had a lot of political connections. He also had good connections to the police, to the military, to a lot of the enforcement, because Zambada descended from this family that was kind of one of those intermediaries, like Quintero was that we talked about earlier. He knew these connections, and Zambada would become very important. And Palma knows a lot of gang connections and enforcers that he can use on the state side, and he also did a very good job of being efficient with taking those precursor supplies and making the best drugs he possibly could. Like Walter said, he made the cleanest crystal you could ever find.
Something about it, this being a work of art. Wow.
And this is why Guzman El Chapo is so famous and did so well and became the first Mexican billionaire. He is not first Mexican billionaire. There were previous Mexican billionaires, but he's the first narco billionaire in Mexico. He did a great job of being able to expand it, and with his ruthlessness and willingness to kill a lot of his underlings that failed because they weren't family, that also gave him a leg up on being able to get professionals that have a little bit more merit, a little bit more specialized into the right positions. And using all of this, he understood how to play political games masterfully. Gallardo in the combat with Tijuana versus Sinaloa, he tried to please the people. He wanted to please the masses. He wanted to have support, which is a weird thing. I found that the cartels genuinely have some support. There's memorials in Mexico to cartel leaders. And there's even songs and ballads written about these men. There's plays written about them. There's some people that worship them. There's actually one that kind of worships himself. But a lot of them tried to make them men of the people, whereas Guzman was the next step ahead, and he understood how to work the political network. And he was a man of the institutions. He understood political power. And one of the biggest things I think that this would be important with is he married his kids into other crime families. And he expanded their power via like a feudal system they saw from the 1200s, where he would marry off into other crime families and bring them into Sinaloa. And then he would also leverage many political and military connections. In fact, the reason why I'm so shocked that the airplane strategy of getting the drugs into America worked was like, or getting the drugs around via plane, wouldn't they be like intercepted, shot down? Like,
We weren't very good at intercepting planes.
you're going to have to edit that out, Alex. No 9/11 jokes here. So during this time, he actually befriended one of the air defense people that were in charge, named General Roboyo. I'm sorry. I looked at the pronunciation. There wasn't anything there that actually was super useful because I saw several pronunciations. But General Roboyo would essentially become this man that was in charge of defending Northwest Mexico's air defense. And America actually built a state-of-the-art radar system for them to be able to intercept these planes, to be able to counteract and interdict them, to be able to bring them down. But he lit so many of them through because he was paid off by the drug cartels. And he actually worked for the Attorney General as well. And I think for a second he was the acting Attorney General for the state of Sinaloa. And because of all this, it looked like no drug cartel activity was happening in his region whatsoever. And because of that, he was promoted to the anti-drug cartel czar.
I'm actually kind of speechless on that. That's insane.
And fun fact, the anti-drug cartel czar, almost all of them worked for the cartel.
It sounds like Guzman would have been a really big fan of Age of Empires.
Yes, I think he would have. So, and he's not doing this alone. He does have Ignacio Corleone, or who's known as Nacho. He is very much a big proponent of being able to maintain support in Sinaloa. He does a lot of public works projects. He can make sure services continue to run to a lot of the poor neighborhoods. He has Zambada, who has all the political connections. He's a big man on negotiating pieces versus just instantly killing everything. And you have Palma, who eventually is arrested in 1995, but he gives Guzman a lot of the connections to the gangs. So during this time, you see them consolidate power because they go into cities like Juarez. You see them go into places like Nuevo Laredo. They attempt to get in there. They do all these things, and by 2006, you see them become the undisputed champions of Mexico in the cartel ring. And something about that is just very interesting to see because it wasn't that he went in and just killed everybody. What happened was usually there was a fight with the head of the cartel, and in those different subsidiaries, the different little groups, Guzman would cut them a better deal. Guzman would essentially guarantee them their spot. He would find a way to work them into his organization. And most of these cartels still exist as separate entities, but they allied themselves and work underneath the Sinaloa umbrella. So it was something where there was not a huge need for bloodshed.
Why does this kind of remind me of Disney?
Because Disney is an entertainment cartel. I don't even think we talked about that. Something I should mention is we need to define what a cartel is. A cartel is essentially different organizations coming together to agree on prices, on regulations, and standards. That is what a cartel is defined as. That is what we should think about when we see this. It's not one organization, it's a bunch of organizations coming together. The biggest one is OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Exporting Countries Cartel. There's actually a elevator cartel, where there's only 3 companies in the world that are worked on elevators that were really large multinational corporations at it, and the EU actually cracked down on them, said you have to split up into different companies. A big one that I think America needs to address, and smaller companies are popping up for a long time. Phones felt like a cartel. You had Sprint, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. That felt like that was the only 4 options. Fortunately, the options have expanded recently, but that was something that for a long time felt like it was a cartel. So that is what a cartel is. And with this, you have Sinaloa essentially taking over the west, and they're trying to expand east. Well, what's going on in the east? The east, it mainly has those borders with Mexico, or they're in Mexico, borders with Texas. You have Brownville, you have Del Rio, and a few smaller places like that, but the big one is Laredo, Texas. That's the big crossing point. There's a big bridge there called the Friendship Bridge. It's where a bunch of buses, bunch of trucks cross every single day. You're getting thousands of trucks crossing at this point. In fact, the large city of Monterrey, which is the manufacturing hub in Mexico, where a lot of Chinese jobs are actually going into Mexico, into Monterrey to manufacture, that goes through Laredo into America. And that is where the Gulf cartel works. The Gulf cartel sees Sinaloa growing and growing and growing. In 1997, they're like, crap, we got to do something about this. So they hire a Mexican commando called Arturo Guzman de Sena, not related to El Chapo Guzman. He goes out and hires 30 Mexican special forces operators, all trained by the United States Special Forces in Fort Bragg, and some of them had even been trained by Israel. This is something where you see a lot of guys with special forces abilities, and they are the guys. They're the best of the best in Mexico, and they've just been paid to defect to the cartel. They also recruit 300 regular soldiers from the Guatemalan military, and there's also reports of them recruiting upwards of somewhere near 1,000 mercenaries to be able to work for them. And these guys form what is called the Los Zetas. And I remember the Los Zetas being a big thing when I was in high school because these guys were the brutal, the nastiest, the worst guys in the whole organized crime sphere. They were murder people. They were the ones that really made using chainsaws to kill people popular. They're the ones that were very big on psychological warfare. They wanted their enemies to know what would happen to them. They're the ones that chop up limbs while people were alive. They're the ones that would do the R word and things like that to their victims. And they were brutal. They were much smaller than anything Sinaloa could throw at them, because there are only about 1,000 soldiers there, and the Sinaloa cartel came back with a similar organization, but the organization just didn't perform as well. It's called Los Negros, and that is the military wing of Sinaloa. They just could not match the Zetas' violence, their ability to be able to just do terrible things. And during the center of all this, if you could pull up the next slide, you have Mexico going into, we'll cover the slide in a minute, Mexico finally opening up into democracy. So during the 80s, the PRI party is essentially holding together as the institution controlling Mexico, but they are forced to more and more times allow free and fair elections. In fact, in 1995, it looked like the PAN, which is the opposing party to the PRI, PRI is left-wing-ish, PAN is right-wing-ish. And during 1995, it looked like PAN was going to win. And then all the news stations had their coverage and cameras cut. And when they came back, PRI was in the lead in the election. And it was well known that this was entirely made up, that it was something that was very intentionally rigged. And it was not lost on anyone. So that essentially deteriorated the government more and more. And then eventually in 2000, PAN won the election then because they were forced to have free and fair elections. The United States was saying you have to be able to do this because also while this is all happening, Mexico signs NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. They have to have free trade between them, which Guzman also utilizes to get more trucks into the United States.
Womp womp.
And through all this, you have George Bush putting pressure, essentially saying you need to deal with this problem to be able to take care of, to be able to continue being a part of NAFTA. And there's some reports of them secretly telling that. They were never public about that. But you see PAN come to power. You see an escalation in the crime fighting by the military. And essentially up until 2000, the PRI, who still thought that they could control the cartels, the only thing that they would really do is like they would burn a few pot fields, which apparently gets you killed these days. They would essentially find one or two opium labs, destroy them. They were very hesitant to get the military super involved, and local police, depending on how clean the guy was, would essentially be on a basis-by-basis subject of seeing if they're able to fight the cartel or not. And there wasn't a huge focus put on it because even though the cartel stuff's important, Mexico's transitioning to a full-on democracy. Mexico's opening up its institutions. Mexico's trying to turn into a place where you have free press, free media. This has not happened before, and that's a long process, so that takes the forefront of everything politically. But in the background, you still have this cartel issue that is growing and growing and growing. So essentially, you have it where it gets to the point in 2003 where the Los Zetas have a summer where they just go on an unabated rampage, trying to take over the cities that Sinaloa controls. And this starts a turf war that is going to kill thousands and thousands of people. The Palma Gallardo turf war killed thousands of people, but this will get to the point where essentially the president of Mexico at the time, Vicente Fox, would send in the military, and he would essentially be trying to have Mexican Marines trying to kill and destroy as many cartel operatives as they could. They would essentially have the police find the information, find the people, and then they would send in the military to go kill them. Usually as Marines, sometimes as Army Special Forces. But that was the hard part. They didn't trust Army Special Forces because it seems like the Army had been fairly compromised at this point.
Yeesh.
But with this, you get to 2006, where this is probably the peak of the cartel, where Sinaloa is bringing in $30 billion a year. You probably have the Gulf cartel, which is Los Zetas there on the map, but Gulf and Los Zetas were essentially the same thing at that point. They control the east, and you notice how that blue and orange controls the west. Even though it shows them as separate organizations, they both really are the same thing. They're both allied together, and you just see this huge divide between the two. And you see that little green in the top left? That is what's left of Gallardo's organization. They're essentially falling apart and collapsing at this point too. But
Rip Bozo.
But Sinaloa's now kings of the castle. And Gulf Cartel is a close second looking there in the east. But they controlled a lot of the border crossings, and the Gulf Cartel did not. Do you have anything out at this point?
No, I'm just invested.
Mm-hmm. But that's a lot of stuff right there, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, in 2006, if I can get my notes together. Alex, edit this out. I'm joking. You don't have to edit it. On the next slide, you see a guy come to power called Felipe Calderon. Calderon would come to power, and he would actually have a bigger chance to focus on the cartel, and he would look at this and say, no, we need to fix this now. Felipe Calderon, I am bad at doing this right now. Felipe Calderon. He wanted closer ties to the United States. He would work very closely with George Bush to be able to have a stronger connection to the United States. And when he comes to power in December of 2006, one of his first actions is to declare war on all cartels in Mexican territory.
Ambitious. And very easy way to paint a huge target on your back, but ambitious.
Exactly. His first move was to go into the state closest to Mexico City, where his center of control was. It's called Michoacan. It's either Michoacan or Michoacan. I think it's Michoacan. But he goes into this or even calling it a province. I'm so used to reading European stuff, and I'm reading ahead a little bit too much. It's not a province, it's a state. They're all states in Mexico. Mexico has a very similar style to the United States, and we have a very similar style to them. We never admit it, but we actually have a lot more in common than we think. Anyways, to this state, he sends 6,500 troops into this state to be able to fight the Michoacan cartel there, which is this radical group that broke off from the Gulf cartel because its leader was this radical guy that called himself Los Más Loco, the most crazy one. He believed that he was God's gift to the earth, and he thought that he was given a divine right to kill whoever he wanted to. He was the man that could kill all, and he would go on a bloodbath massacre, killing 30 people, 20 people, 30 people. He'd do this again and again, and he would have his cartel act the same way, and they essentially have a Bible of his own quotes going around and saying that he's essentially this new divine being. And this is, along with Los Zetas, Calderon's like, we have to stop this. He opens up extradition, and a certain number of these cartel leaders will be sent into the United States where they will be imprisoned. And he does a good job of breaking up the top of the cartel in that state. However, they fragment. And these little subsidiaries without any kind of leadership start turning into little organized crime gangs where they get more intense and more violent because they're trying to fill the power structure that has left. And they are vying for power. And this is essentially turns into a bloodbath where the soldiers have to patrol the streets regularly to make sure that gangs aren't getting ready for a fight. And they sometimes don't get there in time, and there's a lot of fighting. But essentially what happens is the soldiers would patrol the streets. If they don't find any gangs fighting, there's sometimes an ambush waiting for them. So it's essentially a war of ambushes, a planned fight between the gangs, and that is how most of the war would go. So you have that. You have the military launching another operation up into Tijuana because they want to end the fighting there. Tijuana had been a hotbed for fighting for years, and they wanted it to stop. And that is where they would send another 5,000 soldiers up into Tijuana. They would send, I think, about 5,000 soldiers into Juarez. And actually, by the end of this, I think you'll have nearly 100,000 Mexican troops deployed in combat situations across the country, where they'd be in small camps in neighborhoods and villages, trying to get closer to the cartels' points of strength and actually being able to catch them in the act. And whenever they find someone who's a suspected cartel person, they would arrest them immediately and bring them in. So they make arrest a lot of junior bosses of the cartel. They bring a lot of them down, but there's also a lot of human rights violations. They imprison a lot of people that probably should not have been in prison that aren't related to the cartel. And they essentially just go on this campaign of fighting whoever they could. And you have 40,000 people die in Michoacan state alone in 5 years. The casualties are enormous, and some of these won't even count into the homicide deaths we talked about earlier because they're considered casualties of battle.
Yeesh.
And Calderon was also very friendly with having American DEA agents here. He also had different like drone operatives where we'd have American bases where Americans would fly drones looking for cartel activity and things and such as that. And America would also start a plan where we would give them about $1 billion a year in military aid. The first year was $1.8 billion. Barack Obama would re-up it, and I think at that point it would go into $3 billion. So during all this, you have the Sinaloa cartel keep on growing, keep on doing their thing. The Gulf cartel is who Calderon's mainly fighting against. He's the one that wants to be able to end them because they're the most violent. But Sinaloa is also sometimes matching their violence because whenever another cartel raises the stakes, they don't want to look bad, so they also continue as well. I know, it sucks that that's such a circle of violence.
I probably should have expected the episode about the cartels to be intense, but it kind of caught me off guard.
Mm-hmm. So during this time, you have Sinaloa has reached its zenith, but they also are now dealing with people trying to splinter off, create factions, and break away. In 2008, you have a battle in Tijuana where the Arellano Felix Patriarch was arrested, and Sinaloa wants to just essentially take over the city, and they actually go in and execute 38 people in a span of like 3 days, and all of them are decapitated and their bodies are splayed all over the place.
Jesus.
The Juarez cartel is trying to separate itself from Sinaloa. They try to become autonomous, and they want Sinaloa to pay higher fees for them to cross over their city. Guzman says no. And that leads to a big battle where Juarez then flips and says, we're fine, we're going to bring in Los Zetas, and they're going to take control of our toll roads, and you guys are not welcome here anymore, you're going to be killed by them. And then this starts off a big battle where Los Negros and Los Zetas fight each other, and I believe in the big battle in the city of Juarez, there's actually probably about 140 people that would die by the end of it. And this is just terrible because... Yes? Yeah. So Juarez is fighting... Sorry, I don't need to get recentered. That's all right. Juarez does the fight. Juarez turns into a battle where they essentially have Sinaloa doing hit-and-run tactics. They're essentially trying to be able to induce terrorist attacks, and they mainly attack the police stations and whatnot because a lot of Juarez police officers are bought off by the local Juarez cartel. But there's also federal police officers in the city, and then those are mainly bought off by Sinaloa. So what happens is you have these people where Juarez starts a bombing campaign of bombing federal police officers, and then you have Sinaloa starting to kill and assassinate local police officers. And it's just a back and forth bloody mess until finally Sinaloa is able to take a lot of control, and they both still have a presence in the city to this day, but Sinaloa seems to be the larger one. And this is when Calderon's like, we need to send 5,000 troops in. And then another group in their own backyard in the state of Sinaloa, the Beltran-Lueva conflict, where a Beltran-Lueva group breaks off and said, no, we're going to go to the Gulf Cartel. They essentially start this battle. A lot of both families are killed until the Beltran-Lueva family is entirely arrested or killed, one or the other. And that is where Sinaloa is able to try and retain most of those splinter groups that happen there as well. So with this, you have all this fighting and whatnot, and in the middle of it, Nacho Coronel is killed by Mexican Marines, and he has his followers, who is a corps in the Guadalajara area. They essentially splinter off, and they don't follow anyone. For a while, they're going listless, and they kind of just form their own small little factions individually, and they don't turn into one larger cartel at this point, but they will come back later. That's important. So ultimately, between 2006 and 2012, you have Calderon, who's declared the war on drugs, and he has achieved a very mixed legacy. He's arrested many cartel leaders or killed many more. He would bring the USA and Mexico closer. However, he also increased the violence. The intensity of the violence got higher. More people were dying because of it. The deaths just kept on rising, and there was a huge human rights violations committed by the Mexican military. In fact, one of the biggest ones was outside of Monterrey. They would find about 50 bodies that looked like they were killed in an extrajudicial execution by the Mexican military. So then with that, we're gonna zoom through these next presidents because there's not a whole lot more to talk about with some of these guys. Enrique Nieto would come in power. I think it's pronounced Enrique Nieto. He does not like the USA nearly as much as Calderon. He wants to be able to separate Mexico from the DEA agents. He forces them to leave. He forces a lot of the American military operatives to leave. The only ones he leaves there are American advisors that essentially train Mexican forces on how to fight counterinsurgencies, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me because they were fighting insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they fight very differently than cartels. Cartels don't use a whole lot of snipers. They don't use a whole lot of IEDs the same way. Like, they will use bombs, but they very intentionally have a target to bomb. They're not just bombing any car that comes along, and they won't take pot shots at bases like the insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan did. So I don't understand why they're training them, but oh well. And then he would form this thing called the Grupos de Autodefensas, or the self-defense groups, which essentially were locally led groups by landowners, farmers, all sorts of different groups, and they would try to form a people's militia. Except, guess what happens?
They ended up fighting everybody anyway.
Yep. They turn into vigilantes. They essentially sometimes fight the military, they fight the cartels, they fight the police, they fight each other, and they fight on any international aid as well. These essentially turn into vigilante groups that turn into another paramilitary groups used for political reasons, more people using political power, and for a while this actually was another growing issue of just vigilantes trying to take control and become more autonomous. And Mexico's already a hard country to control because of the geography. The people becoming vigilantes makes that 10 times harder.
Yeesh.
And with this, you have him trying to create a national gendarmerie, which they already have federal police, but they're trying to create a national police force that can take on the cartel, and the Ministry of Interior becomes exclusively the sole unit fighting the cartel. They're putting on a small force and a small ministry to be able to take care of all this. They can't handle it because they're trying to push the military out of this situation, and this blows up in his face. Sinaloa starts splintering, and they're trying to keep their alliance together, but different groups are leaving, and eventually this leads to where these small groups are also fighting for dominance, trying to take over, and Sinaloa is still forcing them down, repressing them, and this bloodshed between the small groups in Sinaloa essentially leads where in the mid-2010s, the average number of murders a day was at about 180 by the Sinaloa cartel.
Jeez.
The blood kept on flowing, the people kept on dying, and Sinaloa was still sitting there on top. But during this time, another thing happens where the Gulf Cartel completely dies. The organizations inside the cartel start fighting each other because there is most likely over a dispute over border routes. And again, Los Zetas internally fought. They tried to split off, but they failed because of infighting as well. And essentially in eastern Mexico, you have hundreds of different small organizations fighting over little pieces of land. And you can imagine that Sinaloa is licking their chops at this. They're like, we're going to go in and we're going to get them. We're going to take over. We're going to have Nuevo Laredo, and every major border crossing is going to be ours. And this comes right at the time where Guzman is arrested a second time. We didn't even mention the first time. In 2001, Guzman was arrested. He escaped in a laundry basket that was taken to a van where he was plopped in the van, and then the van went to a gas station, and he made it out, ran out. And then the second time he was arrested.
Looney Tunes escape.
And then the second time he was arrested in 2014. In 2015, he had his men build a 1.5 km tunnel, over a mile tunnel, underneath the prison from a house beyond the prison walls, and he escaped through that tunnel to be out free again. The German engineers came back to bite him. And Guzman was free. And something I should mention is the Mexican prison system. If you're a cartel leader, a jefe, a boss, this is not like American prison. These guys have catered meals. I think I remember reading a lot of reports where Guzman would bring in about 3 to 4 hookers for about 3 to 4 days, and he would be having people come in. He had 3 cell phones, and he'd be holding business calls on all of them. So Guzman was in prison during a lot of this time, but he was able to run his business like nothing ever happened. And that is where I talk about the codes. Anime was used as code for a lot of different cartels. There's a lot of weird things. There's a lot of interesting stuff that I suggest people go in and read because they're really creative, but it's also very horrifying how something cute and kid-friendly can be used so badly. Like Hello Kitty was used for code for the cartels as well. So then you have Guzman escape. And finally, after he's arrested a 3rd time, where they found him at a family reunion, because he had a hard time staying away from the cities. Guzman was a very pompous figure. This is the same word, I shouldn't have said that. He couldn't resist the spotlight. And at this point, the Mexican military had Marines arrest him, and they were smart enough to send him to the United States. In the United States, he's still sitting in prison. Coin, do you mind looking up what prison Guzman's in? El Chapo Guzman. Thank you. So now we're coming in for a landing. We have AMLO come to power. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or otherwise known as AMLO. That is why I'm going to be referring to him here on out. AMLO becomes president, and even though Nito was very much trying to wind down the military, AMLO thought that the military was not the solution at all. And I could see where he's coming from because he had the theory of hugs, not bullets. He believed that if he lifted people out of poverty, the cartel would naturally end on its own. He thought that if he gave amnesty to the farm workers, to the low-level cartel workers, that it would fall apart on its own. So he essentially thought that he could end the cartel through economics, which I understand where he's coming from, but you also have to have the military to back it up, or at least the force to arrest these guys if they step out of line. You have to be able to defeat them and say, hey, there's a better option. It's not like, hey, take peace when they can still just be billionaires. And this is where the murder rate starts climbing again. The cartel actually is starting, you see Sinaloa start taking control of more and more areas. And actually at the very beginning of AMLO's presidency, this group called Los Mata Zetas was a group under Coronel when he got arrested. When he was killed in 2010. That splinter group never formed into a new cartel. What they did in Guadalajara was they essentially held a vendetta against Los Zetos, but they felt betrayed by Sinaloa, so they did their own thing, and they would start murdering members of Los Zetos and the Gulf Cartel and intentionally find each and every person they could, track them down, murder them. They even had this one time where they found this unit of Mexican police officers that they thought were loyal to Sinaloa and Los Zetos and was taking money from both. And that's the theory, at least. They ambushed all 15 of them and killed all 15 of them. This group would become extremely volatile and extremely aggressive, and they would form essentially what became known as the New Generation Cartel. Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. he would take this cartel would all of a sudden launch a terrorism campaign in Guadalajara, and they would take over that region, and they would take over most of southern Mexico by storm, and immediately bring to power a lot of what Los Zetos represented. Except they were trying to pin it back on those people, on the Gulf Cartel, and bring a lot of them to their end. But eventually, they now emerge as the main enemy to Sinaloa, and that is essentially what they turn into. While this is happening, Obrador is promising that, hey, we can lower spending and we can put it into welfare programs. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. Military spending actually goes up 25% under AMLO. He thought that he would be able to provide a lot more amnesty. Very few people came forward looking for the amnesty. And during this time, even though Guzman has been arrested, Sinaloa keeps on continuing to operate and is doing actually a fairly good job of being able to survive. So this comes to the end where we see the head of the New Generation Cartel in Guadalajara. They have this violent campaign for several years. It looks like they're about to take over Sinaloa. However, they hit a point where Cervantes, the leader of their cartel, he was a low-ranking member of the Sinaloa Los Negros group, and he essentially started having a decline in health, and he would become, I won't say invalid. He essentially started having issues health-wise. He couldn't move as much. What?
Look at me, Hector. Sorry.
Not that bad. But this would essentially put a hold on the expansion of the New Generation Cartel. And also with Sinaloa, you would have them mainly looking overseas to expand, because during this time, you see from Chinese precursor sources, places inside China. It's not confirmed that it's the Chinese government, but most theorize that it is. It would fit very much in Chinese foreign policy. But Zambada's getting supplies of fentanyl from China to be able to move it into the United States, and that market has taken up almost as much profit as methamphetamine has for Sinaloa. So now this is the current situation where I think this is a little bit generous. If you see all that red that is Sinaloa right now, most of the purple is genuinely Sinaloa controlled, but there's also people trying to contest them there, smaller organizations. The blue is the New Generation Cartel. They also have a strong presence in that northeast area, but this is mostly Sinaloa's area and Sinaloa's prime. And then Sinaloa is preparing for a long conflict with the New Generation Cartel. Out of nowhere, Lopez Guzman, the son of El Chapo Guzman, would all of a sudden bring up Zambada, and they actually had a fairly good relationship. And he was asking him about buying some property in Sinaloa. They would go together and meet, but Guzman Jr., El Chapo's son, would go and kidnap him and bring him to the United States, to Phoenix, Arizona, where Zambada is also now on July 25th in 2024 arrested, and now he's also going to be in prison in America for the rest of his life. So now Sinaloa has no leadership. They have none of the old guard left anymore, and they are going to have a big issue with being able to replace that. All right, so to end, AMLO's presidency has shown that not a lot has gotten done to defeat the cartels. If the cartels splinter, it seems like they fragment into more violent groups. And one of the bad things was Zambada, being 76 years old, he had connections to all the different crime families in Mexico. He's going back to the beginning with them. And he had a preference for negotiating peace over fighting it out, and he helped keep the Sinaloa cartel together and at peace for the most part. Now he's gone. And as of today, October 3rd, we are 2 days into the presidency of Claudia Sheinbaum. She has been elected as Mexico's, I believe, 66th president. And she has a program very similar to AMLO of trying to produce more welfare programs, more infrastructure programs to be able to lift people out of poverty so they don't need to rely on the cartels for any kind of support. However, it does not seem like she is expected to create a new force able to combat them, and it's very much unknown how she's going to treat them military-wise, because there has been a creation of something new called the National Guard. It's not similar to America's National Guard at all. It's essentially taking Mexican special forces and giving them boundaries and restraints to make them more like a police force instead of a full-on military unit. And it's still up in the air if that's going to be completed or not. And it appears that Scheinbaum has a lot on her plate because she also has a lot to deal with the economy, a lot to deal with healthcare, a lot to deal with education. And this is where Mexico is sitting right now, with a young cartel on the rise that seems to be just as violent as Los Zetas, and the Sinaloa cartel losing its key piece that held it together. And we're here to offer our analysis and predict what we think will happen. And while you make guessing what your predictions are, I think something that we forgot to mention last time is just how this impacts the world. Big thing is for America, when Sinaloa was at its height and zenith, it caused a huge issue for immigration, where it forced a lot of people to leave their homes, and a lot of them went into America. Huge waves of Mexican immigration happens because of the battles, the fighting in these major cities. A lot of people are displaced, and that forces them to look for greener pastures, and a lot of that is over the border. And I feel like this has affected America dramatically, where you see a lot of this pouring into American cities, where you have a lot of people immigrating here that don't really have a lot of chance to be able to integrate or really be able to have a solid or stable experience coming into the United States. And that can cause a lot of problems for them. And I also see where the effects of this can be felt all around the country, because fentanyl has become an issue. Meth has always been an issue. I've had personal family issues with addiction. And I think that this is something that affects a lot of Americans. And we are all casualties of this. I definitely don't want to blame the Mexican people, because there's other countries that have drug cartels and whatnot, and expansion into foreign markets. But I really do see that this is something that does affect Americans a lot. But I remember 2006 was a big year for immigration. A lot of people across the border during that time, many legally, many illegally. And that was because of the fighting of the Sinaloa cartel with Tijuana and Juarez. That is something where I think if violence spikes in those northern cities, especially in Monterrey, where a lot of jobs are being created, if Monterrey and Nuevo Laredo, which is across the border from Laredo, explode, that can have a profound impact on the United States, and especially in the geopolitical things. We need Mexican manufacturing. We need to lean into it. We need to be able to befriend it. And I think that is something where we are going to see a lot of price issues, cost of living can be resolved if we help Mexico in this situation. Mexico also has to want help. Scheinbaum has not expressed much want for American involvement in anything. And I honestly don't know if American legal or military forces are the ones specialized to deal with it. So that just leaves a lot to be desired and a lot of questions to be asked on how does one tackle that. I honestly think a UN force might do a better job, because they won't be as corrupted. Most likely not as corrupted. UN has some questionable decision making. But what are your predictions before I make my predictions?
I think, like you said, this impacts more than just Mexico. It has a grander impact on neighboring countries and the world at stage at large. I can't say predictions for specifics and what situations could arise, but I will say that things don't look great. I don't feel very hopeful that the situation is going to improve anytime soon, unless some how much more drastic in terms of measures can you take after all the stuff that you mentioned earlier today? How much more drastic can you get? That one guy's plan of trying to use raise people out of poverty to lower the cartel's amount of power might be effective if they focused on that a little bit more, but they'd have to actually deal damage like actual direct damage to the cartels themselves also, so that they don't look very appealing as an alternative.
Mhm.
So it's a two-way solution that they only seem to be tackling from one way pretty poorly. In terms of how to do more direct damage to the cartel, I think, yeah, asking for help from the United States or from the UN or both would be the best bet. Huge amount of crackdowns, making deals with people to sell each other out, try to get them to increase in infighting is already happening. When we saw what that did, that just leads to more fighting. So they'd have to find a way to stabilize them without causing smaller splinter groups to form, which is not something I can see being able to do with all the history that they have of smaller splinter cells growing and causing even more problems because they're just more violent. Yeah, I don't know what they would do. Things aren't looking good.
Yeah, they aren't looking good. My prediction is that we will see the new generation cartel challenge Sinaloa and take more border crossings, control more assets, have more political influence, because it doesn't seem that the Sinaloa cartel is, since Guzman since Guzman was arrested, that they have expanded their control of political institutions. Neither does it seem like Zambada invested a whole lot in that at his end stage of life. I just don't believe that we're going to see a large cartel take over, because new generation, after doing research, it seems like it's very hierarchical and very much Kingpin style. And if one of those Kingpins get taken out, like their head, if he gets taken out and there's a lot of infighting, I think you're going to see where the large cartel dies and we see the end of that era, and the new era of all these small little groups operating will pop up. So I imagine if Mexico does not enact a very strong military hand with also a strong welfare program, because I'm bias alert. I'm not against welfare programs at all. I just think that spending has to be within reason. But I think this is one of those examples of they need to be able to reduce poverty so new recruits aren't created. But we also need them to be able to have institutions and things like water be consistent for everyone. Need things like roads. Need things like energy. They need to be able to provide all that to those smaller communities and not have the cartel do it. And they need to be able to respond to threats in kind and have a core group that is not corrupted. That is a big thing that Colombia did, and it was very helpful in defeating the cartel there. I think Mexico can do it. I don't know if Sheinbaum's the person to do it, but I think if she utilizes her tools correctly, things can go well. But I predict she's going to lean in on the economic stuff to be able to get her party more votes. They are going to raise poverty levels up, but it is still going to be an issue where she's not going to outlast the cartels, and small little groups are going to form their own little independent cartels, and violence will continue to happen until someone is able to counteract these small groups on a local level and fight the corruption.
Another possibility that I just thought of, like another possible solution, is just capitalism in and of itself. And by that I mean finding a way to incentivize the cartels is to invest in other forms of income besides drugs and violence. I mean, that's a crack shop pipe dream, but I don't know. Maybe force cooperation with them, force them to do things that aren't illegal.
It would be radical, but that proposal was on the table in Colombia during the late 80s, early 90s. And there was some hope of that, where the cartels essentially turned into banks.
Right, like you were just talking about Mexico's infrastructure problem. There's a huge labor force right there. And I mean, if the Mexican government could incentivize them to do that instead of do drugs, sell drugs, then that solves two problems with one stone.
Instead of American boots on the ground, how about American construction equipment on the ground, and we help build that?
Right.
That could be a lasting thing we do, but I think that is all the time we have for now. We've probably been recording for a little bit too long, but I want to say next time we're going to have a double header for 2 episodes that we're going to try and figure out a way to condense down enough. The first one is going to be on the economy and talking about things that have happened in September. If you're not familiar with finance, September is a big month for the United States economy. A lot of reports come out, a lot of information comes out, and that's technically when the fiscal year for the United States ends, is in September. And it starts in September. And a lot of the reports and a lot of the goals and a lot of the budgets and legislations are predicted at that time. So we'll be talking about the economy. And the second one, to be striking while the anvil is hot, and also to keep true to our name as casualities, talking about things that impact the world, need to be talked about. I believe we do need to talk about the current situation going on in Israel and Lebanon in particular, and talk about Hezbollah and a little bit of history and diving deep into that. And seeing what we can divulge. And we're recording this on October 3rd. As of right now, Israeli troops small units have pushed into Lebanon. There's been no major ground attack, but that does appear that can change any given time now. So that is where we're at right now. Thank you.
And we're done. Get out of here. We don't want you here anymore. Leave. Go do something else with your time.
Why'd you listen to us for so long?